All right, so welcome everybody to, this is session 27 of the Philosophers in the Midst of History. And what we do each year is in the spring we do an ancient thinker, and then in the early summer, actually May, we do a medieval thinker, and then in the fall we do an early modern thinker, and then, not quite winter time, but pretty close to it, we do what we call a late modern thinker, so usually somebody from the 19th or 20th century. And the person that we're going to look at today is, you could call her Anglo-Irish. She was born in Ireland. Irish identity was kind of important for her, but she spent most of her time in Britain. She's a philosopher, but also a novelist and an essayist, and did quite a few other interesting things. Iris Murdoch. And she's, if you know her, you probably know her more for her literary work, because she wrote just a slew of novels over the course of her lifetime. But she was also a pretty important philosopher. She gave the Gifford Lectures, which is kind of, one of the top achievements. That's where this book ultimately came from, Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, good number of years later than the Gifford Lectures. And what we do in this series, so it's called Philosophers in the Midst of History, and we look at the history that these people lived in and like what formed them, what influences. Some of it's intellectual history, some of it's their biography, some of it is more like the big picture events. Like she didn't fight in World War II, but she certainly her career was given some leanings, let's say, because of World War II. And we also look at the other end of it, where did these people have any effect on history? And Iris Murdoch maybe less than some of the people that we've looked at, like René Descartes or Friedrich Nietzsche. But she did have an important effect on at least intellectual history, and she's got some very interesting things to say. And so, we'll also talk about some of her key ideas as well. And she actually has, so there's an essay that I'm going to be quoting from at a couple points called Against Dryness, a Polemical Sketch. And she says very early on in that, philosophy, like the newspapers, is both the guide and the mirror of its age. So philosophy in a very broad sense, intellectual life, guides whatever age you're in, but it's also reflective of it. So there's a nice, back and forth dynamic. And, I've given you a sort of timeline thing that tells you, there's two sides to it. There's what Murdoch is doing, what everybody else is doing, right? And so she lived a long time, born in 1919, dies in 1999. The last 2 years of her life, maybe 3 actually, because some people think that her last novel wasn't quite as good as the previous ones. She suffered from Alzheimer's, but she lived a pretty long and fruitful and productive life. When she did die, she died at home, attended by her husband, and she had a pretty good life, you could say. Unlike some of the other people that we've looked at where like their childhood sucked, it was terrible. For example, next year we're going to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, and her life was much shorter. And her childhood was not great, in part because her dad loved get-rich-quick schemes. And you don't usually get rich quick when you do those. You get poor quick. And so they had to move from place to place, and she didn't have a lot of opportunities. Well, Iris Murdoch was almost the opposite of that in many respects. She was, born into a loving household. Her mother and father got together after World War I ended. Very quick romance. They're living in Ireland, and they're from somewhat different families. Her mother was from a Church of Ireland family, so think Anglican church, but just Irish. And her father was from a Presbyterian family, but neither of them took it very seriously. They were much more about, enjoying each other's company, and actually they wouldn't stay there very long. And they only had one kid, and she talked about them being like a loving trinity, getting along very well. They moved to London very early on in her life, and she gets enrolled in this Froebel demonstration school. So Froebel's the guy who came up with kindergarten. He's a very progressive German educator, and sort of like the Montessori schools that we have here in the States, let the kids develop at their own pace, let them play and stuff like that. That's what the Froebel school was like. And not everybody thrives in an environment like that, but Iris Murdoch did, because she was pretty headstrong and took initiative and smart. So in an environment like that, plus she could actually walk to school. Her dad would walk her to school, And so that, she had a pretty good upbringing that way. Her father was working in the Ministry of Health, so they had a reliable job. And then she goes to this boarding school, the badminton school. And interestingly, it's called the badminton school. They did play badminton there. It was one of the few schools where they thought sports should really be an important part of the curriculum. So she's getting physical exercise, which, I think we all kind of take that for granted, but it wasn't always the case back then. And they had lots of, extracurricular activities, very broad curriculum. She was an avid reader. She already starts writing as a kid. She thinks that she wants to become a writer. And, already as a kid, she's writing essays. So she writes one in 1935 called How I Would Govern the Country. And, nice big scope there. She's criticizing both totalitarianism, which is rising at the time, and imperialism. And she goes to Oxford. She goes to Somerville College, and originally she thought she was going to study English, which meant essentially literature and writing. But she instead switches over to grades, which is something that we don't actually have here. We have things that are a little bit like that, but not quite so much. So the grades curriculum at that time was Greek and Roman history and philosophy. And the philosophy included Plato and Aristotle. So she's getting introduced to these thinkers. And then you'd also study some modern philosophy. You pretty much skip all the medieval stuff. You ignored the Hellenistic philosophy. It's interesting because she will talk a lot in this book about the Stoicism, but she kind of gets it wrong, in part because she doesn't have a deep background in it. But at that time, almost nobody did, So it's quite understandable. And while she's at Oxford, you notice, what are the years? 1938, right? So World War II, at least in the European theater, is going to begin shortly after that. England or Great Britain is involved in the war in a massive way. A lot of the young men start filtering out and going off to war. And so it's interesting, she's going to school at a time where women are not given the same opportunities as men for the most part, right? But wartime changes a lot of that stuff. Like here in the United States, we think of it in terms of like women going into the workforce, factories, Rosie the Riveter, what was it? We Can Do It on that iconic poster. So she's at Oxford, and that means that there's less guys taking classes. There's more women going to school, and there's more scope for them to sort of spread their wings. And not only is she there at that time, there's a couple other important women philosophers in the 20th century who she meets in her classes. And her time there overlaps with them. Philippa Foot, who she will have a lifelong relationship with, Mary Midgley, GEM, which is actually sort of a moniker, or Alice Ambrose. These are going to become important philosophers, and each of them is, Elizabeth Anscombe. Each of them is going to make contributions on their own, and Murdoch is going to make some major contributions as well. Now, she graduates in 42, and the war isn't over, right? So it's not just men being drafted. Everybody's being drafted for things. And she finds herself going to work in London for His Majesty's Treasury. It was, do that or do some other sort of job. And, she's going to do well with that. A little bit later on, she's going to leave the Treasury. And before the war is even over, she is going to go to work for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration as an administrative officer. And we'll talk a bit more about that in just a bit. During all this time, she joins the Communist Party, as quite a few young people were doing. And one of the things that she says about this, a little bit later on, sort of retrospectively, is, I went in, as a lot of people did, out of a sense which arose during the Spanish Civil War preceding World War II, that Europe was dangerously divided between left and right, and we were jolly well going to be on the left. We had passionate feelings about social justice. We believed that socialism could produce just and good societies without poverty and without strife. And then she says, I lost those optimistic illusions fairly soon, so I left it. But it was just as well, in a way, to have seen the inside of Marxism, because then one realizes how strong and awful it is, certainly in its organized form. So that was her verdict. And this would actually continue to affect her over the course of her life. She left the party, but once you've actually been in the party, you are sort of tarred for life. And she was, after she gets out, she wants to go to Vassar College, and she actually wins a scholarship there. She can't go because the U.S. won't give her a visa because she was at one time a communist. So she ends up going to Newnham College in Cambridge, and there she's going to work under somebody who we're going to talk about a little bit later, John Wisdom, who's another interesting British philosopher. And then she graduates, and she becomes what's called a fellow at St. Anne's College, Oxford. Oxford is its own weird, special world. So being a fellow means that you're essentially on the staff, right? And she begins teaching philosophy classes, and she goes on teaching them for quite a while. Meanwhile, she's writing. So her first book is on Jean-Paul Sartre, and to a lesser extent, other existentialists. And she's, it's one of the first studies of Sartre's philosophy in English. And then she writes her first novel, Under the Net. In 1956, she's going to marry this guy, John Bailey, who is an intellectual himself. He's a literary critic, a novelist. He's a professor. And you can, you notice all the books that she's publishing as she's sort of cranking them out. 56, The Flight from the Enchanter. 57, The Sandcastle. 58, The Bell. 61, A Severed Head. She's quite productive, right? While she's also teaching. And she regarded herself, I mentioned that officially she's Irish because she's born in Ireland. And she is Northern Irish, right? She's a Protestant. Well, not really, because she leaves religion behind. But, it's sort of like, you guys know that old joke that used to be told about the Irish during the time of the Troubles. A Jewish guy goes into a bar, and they're like, which are you, a Catholic or a Protestant? And he's like, I'm not either. I'm Jewish. I don't have a dog in this fight. And then they're like, well, are you a Catholic Jewish person or a Protestant Jewish person, right? Because everybody had to have a line. And, that was actually quite difficult for people like Murdoch, who thought that there was, injustice often on both sides, as there was. So, she regarded herself as being Irish, but in a complicated sense. In a 1982 letter to Philippa Foot, she wrote, "It was nice being in Normandy, but the sounds of all those Irish voices made me feel privately sick. They just couldn't help sympathizing with the IRA like Americans do, a bad, mad world, because of the violence that was taking place." She also said out in 1978, "My Irishness is Anglo-Irishness. In a very strict sense, people sometimes say to me rudely, 'Oh, you're not Irish at all.' But of course I'm Irish. I'm profoundly Irish, and I've been conscious of this all my life and in a mode of being Irish, which has produced a lot of very distinguished thinkers and writers, many of whom went off to Britain themselves, right?" And, this is sort of part of her back history. When it comes to intellectual influences, she claims about herself, and I think this is probably false, but it's always good to have an origin story. She cited Simone Weil's Waiting for God as one of the only 3 philosophical works that deeply influenced her. Again, I think she's been influenced by more. The other 2 being Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling and Plato's Symposium, which is this wonderful dialogue about love. It's actually one of the greatest works of Western literature. Coming back to her work life, so, she said, "When I finished my undergraduate studies, I was conscripted." Everybody was. So, I was going to have to work somewhere. I would have liked to stay at Oxford and study for a PhD, but that just wasn't a possibility. I was anxious to go on learning, but you had to sacrifice your wishes for the war, for the country. So I went into the civil service. She also said, and this is kind of interesting, "There was a time when I wanted to be an archaeologist, an art historian, when I was at Oxford. And I couldn't go on with that art history because I was conscripted," right? It took me away from the academic world, but I was taken over by the desire to be a philosopher by the end of the war. In the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, first she's stationed in London, and then she's transferred to Brussels. And being transferred to Brussels sounds pretty nice now, but Brussels was in a shambles, right? Everything had been destroyed. And then to Innsbruck, Austria, then to Graz, Austria, where she worked in a refugee camp. And she said of the work that they did, it was concerned with displaced persons, lots of Yugoslavs and Poles, every sort of person who had to be identified and looked after. A number of them, particularly Yugoslavs, didn't want to go back to their homeland. It was absolutely frontline stuff, and much of the time one was simply preoccupied with feeding people. But in general, the problem was so enormous that you couldn't do much other than feeding them and being nice to them. There was an utter breakdown of society, and it was instructive to witness that. So this made an impact on her, right? She's still pretty young, just out of college, seeing the devastation of the war, and not just seeing it in the landscape, but in the people that she's dealing with. Going on to St. Anne's, she teaches philosophy there, and then she goes to the Royal College of Art and teaches in the General Studies Department, and begins publishing. She made a good bit of money off of her books, but she viewed that as like her craft, her work that she's doing. So that's her work life is an important part. We should also talk about her relationships. Murdoch is now what we would use the term queer for. She has a great number of sexual relationships with people while being married to her husband, both men and women, and one of which goes on for a very, very long time. So, one of her journal entries, she says, "Love is perhaps the only subject on which I am an expert." And, she marries this guy, John Bailey, but Bailey is okay with this because Bailey said that sex was inescapably ridiculous, Right? So what we would nowadays, in some respects, call a beard. A person who you marry so that you can then have, you can do your things, but you've got a sort of stable, public-facing image. Murdoch actually had, quite a few different affairs. One of which it was kind of a bombshell when it broke. People published her letters. Philippa Foot. So this woman that she had gone to college with, who's going to become a major philosopher in her own right, they were friends for many, many years. Occasionally they'd have tiffs and break up and then get back together. 1968, their relationship actually becomes physical, and they would continue on for a long time. And she says in a letter, "Sometimes I feel I have to invent a language to talk to you in, though my heart is very full of definite things to say. You stir some very deep part of my soul. Be patient with me and don't be angry with my peculiarities. I love you very much." So, some tenderness there between the two of them. She was also involved with this other woman, Brigid Antonia Brophy, who was another English author known as a literary critic, but also as a social reformer. She had a lot of causes that she was pushing, including vegetarianism, humanism, animal rights, but also gay rights as well. And we're going to see, in her lifetime, we're not going to see gay marriage or anything like that, but homosexuality will be decriminalized in Britain. So there's an opening to this. She was also involved with this guy, Elias Canetti, who was a Bulgarian guy who wrote his works in German. She kept that one a secret until her death in 1999. Even her closest friends thought that he had only been a mentor. Turns out they were having a long-term affair. She called him an angel demon and actually used him to some degree as a model for some of the figures in her stories. And they're not good figures. they're sort of tyrannical types of figures, including the Flight of the Enchanter, which she devotes to him. So, she dedicates that book to him. John Updike, who knew her, said that love was for Murdoch what the sea was for Joseph Conrad, and war was for Ernest Hemingway. He considered her the leading English novelist of her time and thought that she learned the human condition, which is very important for philosophers and novelists, through her relationships, through engaging in affairs and, having things break down and loving and forgiving and all of those sorts of things. And so he calls her love life a long tutorial in suffering, power, treachery, and bliss, right? Which is kind of that's just Updike, right? He's a good wordsmith, right? But I think that's a true way of looking at things. Murdoch is very much about figuring things out from where we are in our lives, not just engaging in abstraction and sticking with that sort of stuff. So the last thing I'll tell you about, and then maybe we'll take a little break for any Q&A. So when we think about philosophy, right, philosophy is not the same in every single place and time. There's different movements, there's different styles, there's different ways in which it's done. The way philosophy is understood in relation to other areas of life, other academic fields, changes from time to time and place to place. So what was dominating Britain, especially the places where she was, Oxford and Cambridge at the time, was what was called analytic philosophy, which is still around. And analytic philosophy starts in the early 20th century, and it's a reaction against metaphysics. And you notice, metaphysics is a guide to morals, right? So she is not buying into their program. The early analytic philosophers like metaphysics is bosh. That was, a British word for garbage or BS. They had different terminology, and it's a counter reaction, there's a shift towards making philosophy much more narrow in its scope. Maybe philosophy should be like the handmaid of the sciences, or it should be concentrating just on language and conceptual analysis, or strictly working on logic or things like that. That's sort of the dominant movement at the time. In ethics, there were a couple, we could call them now traditional moral theories like utilitarianism, the idea that we should work for the best outcomes for everybody affected, or deontology, meaning sort of like a duty-based ethics. Those were popular, but the biggest going concern was what was called emotivism. This notion that all this ethics stuff, this is all nonsense. Most of it is just people, trying to coerce other people into seeing things from their point of view, or it's expression of emotion. We're not really doing anything serious with that. And she doesn't buy any of this. She thinks, no, that is not a really workable way of doing things. But that's where a lot of the people at the time were, and to some degree, in some places still are. So if you've ever heard of Bertrand Russell or Ludwig Wittgenstein or Carnap and the Vienna Circle, A.J. Ayer, he had a book called Language, Truth, and Logic that was very popular. Anthony Flew. These are the people that are the big names at the time. A little bit later, in the 40s, you've got Gilbert Ryle and J.L. Austin, and they're engaging in linguistic analysis. So that's the stuff that's dominating the milieu. But that's not everybody. And there were other thinkers who are, sort of doing more traditional philosophy, reading Plato, reading Aristotle, taking them seriously. And there were a couple other people who were quite important. I mentioned John Wisdom. So she later on will study under John Wisdom. Wisdom is a very, very interesting writer because he's doing analytic philosophy. He's the guy who actually comes up with the word analytic philosophy. But he's also very interested in literature. He's interested in Freudian psychoanalysis. He's interested in what those existentialists are doing over there in the continent. So he's reading other people. He's not saying, get rid of that metaphysics garbage. That's all silly bosh. We're going to do real philosophy now. He's taking that stuff seriously, but he's doing it in a way that analytics can actually understand. R.J. Collingwood, if you've ever run across him, very interesting philosopher. He's in that same milieu. He takes earlier philosophy seriously. He doesn't think we have to get rid of metaphysics. He's very interested in art and history. Another guy who she doesn't seem to have had any contact with, but was important, W.D. Ross, a translator of Aristotle, comes up with some very interesting ethical theories of his own. So there's openings. There's ways of reading these things. And when you look at Murdoch, she read voluminously. She didn't just... Actually, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. Sometimes in not just philosophy, but I think in other fields, people will rest content with what it is that their professors recommend. So they'll be like, well, so-and-so's reading list says read this person, this person, this person. This person isn't on their list, so it must not be important, right? So there's a lot of students who are content with that sort of thing. They're like, well, they know better than I do, right? And it's already enough to read all these people. Why would I want to bother with all this crap over here? So Murdoch didn't do that. Murdoch read whatever she wanted to read. Whatever she thought was interesting, she would read it. And that's the best way to actually get a good education. You can learn from your professors, but that's reflective of what they think is important. You don't know whether they're actually correct about that until you don't know whether it's worth reading René Descartes until you actually read him, right? And you see whether there's anything there. If you rely on somebody saying, oh, no, don't bother with him, nobody takes him seriously anymore, you don't know. You have to actually check it out. And so she was a checker-outer, you could say, right? And I want to actually say another thing, too. So British philosophy really, throughout the modern period, it's always got what we can call an empiricist bent. So empiricism is a approach that says we need to look at realities in front of us that we can experience. Don't go off into all sorts of flights of fancy or anything like that. We need to check things out. And you probably want to stay fairly close to the sciences. But empiricism comes from the word empiria, which means experience. Now, Murdoch, as far as I can tell, she mentions him, and she does a great many other people, but I don't think she had any contact in any way with William James. But William James, here, a great American philosopher, he said the empiricists are not empirical enough. What we need is real empiricism. Pay attention to your day-to-day life, right? Or your love affairs, or what work is like, or stuff like that. If those aspects are left out of philosophy, that's not good for philosophy. Philosophy has to be broad enough to get into our ordinary lives. Again, in that against dryness, she's going to say a few things that I want to bring up here. So she says, we live in a scientific and anti-metaphysical age in which religion has lost much of its power. So she's saying this way back. When was this published? I don't know the year of it offhand. But, I think that's probably true of the 20th century. It's probably still true of our century, although we see a resurgence in some forms of religion. And she says, we've not recovered from 2 wars in the experience of Hitler. We're also heirs of the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and the liberal tradition. These are the elements of our dilemma, whose chief feature is that we've been left with too shallow and flimsy an idea of human personality. Now, who does she blame this on? Philosophers. Philosophers, not just them, psychologists as well, they have gutted our intellectual resources. And so she says, from Hume through Bertrand Russell, with a friendly help from mathematical logic and science, we derive the idea that reality is a quantity of material atoms, and significant discourse must relate itself directly or indirectly to reality so conceived. Roughly, for my inner life, for me just as for others, is identifiable as existing only through the application of it to public concepts which can be constructed on the basis of overt behavior. There's a word for this, behaviorism, that was very popular in psychology, but also in philosophy at the time. And then she says, at the same time, we also get this idea from Kant and from Hobbes through Bentham, the picture of an individual as a free, rational will, like this abstract individual who, you're the same as I am in that respect. We all can just choose for ourselves. We're not truly affected by our environment or anything like that. And she goes on to say that this is actually bad for us. Ideas can actually limit the way in which we understand ourselves. And then she goes on and she talks about, well, is it any better over on the continent? And she's somebody who's written on Jean-Paul Sartre, and she's like, Sartre seems to be offering us something different than the other existentialists, but it's really the same thing. It's this self that is very abstract. He says, the individual is pictured as solitary and totally free. There's no transcendent reality, no degrees of freedom. On the one hand, there's the mass of psychological desires and social habits and prejudices. Not good. You don't want to give in to that stuff because then you're living an inauthentic life. On the other hand, there's the will, and that's it. This blind choice. So if you know much about Sartrean existentialism, that's a decent picture of it, right? And so she's saying, there's got to be something better than this. Let me see if I can articulate it, So she goes on and she says, we suffered a general loss of concepts, the loss of a moral and political vocabulary. We no longer use a spread out, substantial picture of the virtues of man and society. We no longer see man against a backdrop of values, of realities which transcend him. We picture man as a brave, naked will surrounded by an easily comprehended empirical world. For the hard idea of truth, we have substituted a facile idea of sincerity. And that was sincerity, authenticity, whatever synonym you want. That was a big, big deal in like the 40s through the, all the way up until like the 80s or so, in culture, in philosophy. And she's saying this isn't good. We need something that is actually bigger than us, that we can connect with. Now, does that mean like we return back to tradition and we say, things were better in the Middle Ages? She's not for that at all. She thinks we have to have a way forward. And she's going to develop that in her own philosophy, but not in a satisfyingly systematic way where everything fits perfectly well together. It's like she's constantly reworking it and trying to bring together certain themes. So before we launch into talking about her philosophy and what it means for her to be a Platonist in the 20th century, so a follower of Plato in some respects, I've already talked to you quite a bit. Any questions about her life, this background stuff? Because this is going to be a springboard into... So far we've said like what she doesn't like. I'll tell you what she does like in a minute, but any questions before that? Or should I plow through? Plow through? Okay. So one thing I want to say before we actually like look at the things that she tells us. So I called her a Platonist. She calls herself a Platonist, right? And what would that mean? Being a follower of Plato. And this goes way, way back. Plato had his academy, and one of the things that came out of the academy was that there is a doctrine that Plato gives you in his dialogues. If you've read Platonic dialogues, they're sometimes confusing, and there's a lot of points of view, but you can put together kind of a coherent picture. Like there's a form of the good, and there's forms and material objects or copies of forms and all of that sort of stuff, right? Plato also stresses the virtues, that we need to cultivate what we call the four cardinal virtues of wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. And each of these is also like one of those ideal forms, but it exists in us and our actions and arrangements. And none of it in us is ever perfect. It's the form that's perfect. But you can't see the form. You can't smell it. You can only grasp it with your mind. And only to some degree, especially while we're here in the body. So this was a point of view that would get developed and redeveloped by all sorts of thinkers throughout the ages. If you've ever read Plutarch, his Parallel Lives, that's how most people encounter him. Plutarch was a Platonic philosopher. And he's got just as much of his biographies, he's got writings as a Platonist that are philosophy. Later on, Plotinus, who she mentions quite a bit, Neoplatonism, we call that. And Platonism is it's a major background for the thought of the church fathers, whether they're Augustine or John Cassian or pick whoever you want. It reemerges again as a really important force in the Renaissance. There's Cambridge Platonists in the early modern period. It never goes away, and it's always different. It's always being readapted. So her Platonism is a very, very late Platonism. It's a Platonism for the 20th century and beyond. It's not, Plato had it all figured out. It's more like Plato set some agendas for us, gave us some tools, but he didn't, he was living way the hell back then. He didn't know about, totalitarianism and World War II and refugees and stuff like that. He didn't know about modern life and technology. We have to rethink things from a Platonic point of view in the present. And to take a position like that, it's really quite bold because there aren't a hell of a lot of Platonists out there. It's not like being a neo-Aristotelian. There's tons of them out there, or being a modern Stoic. There's tons of them out there. The community of people who are like Platonists, but in an adaptive sense, it's pretty small. But she thinks that this is the way to go. So I'm actually going to, in characterizing her approach to things, there's another philosopher who I particularly like and have drawn on a lot in my life, Alasdair MacIntyre, probably one of the best-known contemporary virtue ethicists, along with like Martha Nussbaum and Julianus and people like that. And MacIntyre did a very interesting review of a book about Iris Murdoch back in 1982. So he said, it's always dangerous to impute a character's views to an author, but in Iris Murdoch's case, there's a special hazard. Just because she does seem to hold that what makes utterances true or false is not what makes the statements true or false. So a true statement can be uttered as a falsehood, but not, I take it, vice versa. Her characters sometimes appear, for the moment at least, to deprive Iris Murdoch's philosophical views of credulity by the way in which they utter them. And then he goes on and says, when I say that Iris Murdoch's novels are philosophy, my claim has very little to do with the fact that her characters sometimes talk about Wittgenstein or quote Heidegger or Kant and go to dinner with Oxford philosophers, or that she makes philosophical jokes. What her novels systematically embody is a theory about theories, a theory which is to some degree against all theory, including itself. And if this does not entail she had to be a novelist, it's at least clear that such a point of view could never have received adequate expression merely at the level of theory. Philosophy is theory, right? For the most part, novels are, you've got characters, you've got plots, you've got imperfect people screwing things up. A lot of them have affairs with each other, get caught, and do bad things, and then feel bad about it afterwards, or don't feel bad about it afterwards, and justify their actions. MacIntyre goes on, and he says, here is a doctrine which links the supremacy of Plato's form of the good with its simplicity of perfection to the need to write about particular cases in detail as the novelist or the dramatic poet writes. Plato himself would have expelled the poets from the Republic and understood the mimesis of art as a source of illusion. So a Neoplatonic novelist seems to be an embodied contradiction. He's saying that that's what Murdoch is. She's Platonist, and she's a contradiction because of that. And then he says, I call her that because she exhibits the same freedom in reworking Platonic themes that Neoplatonists do, but also because she shares with some of them a repudiation of belief in the God of Christian theology and an acceptance of mysticism. And then he quotes her saying, the background to morality is properly some kind of mysticism, if by this is meant a non-dogmatic, essentially unformulated faith in the reality of the good, capital G good, occasionally connected with experience. And that is very Platonic. Plato thought that there's all these forms, right? That's the ideal world, and this is just sort of a dim copy of it. And the form that is like the greatest is the form of the good or the beautiful. He talks about it as like analogous to the sun. It is not a being, it is beyond being. It is what gives everything its goodness, everything that participates in it. And it's not personal, it's not God. It's not like a Christian God or a Jewish God or, a Muslim version of God. Jewish monotheistic Platonists turned the form of the good into God. But for Plato, that's not the case. It's impersonal. It's something that we can dimly grasp and orient ourselves by. That's important for Murdoch. As screwed up as her life is, that's what orients her. And you can say, and this is one scholar's take, Lawrence Bloom, who says that there's three distinct strands within Murdoch's conception of moral reality. And to talk about moral reality, that's a big deal already there. Because a lot of people think, there's no such thing. It's all subjective. She's like, no, there is a moral reality. It's just one that we often get mixed up about. So what are they? Metaphysics is one part of it. There's got to be some metaphysical depth to our views on things, or else we can't really do much of anything. Metaphysics and morality, they're not the same thing, but they do kind of connect up together. The form of the good, That's really central. And then other persons. Other persons understood not as just like another me, like a copy of me that I project out there, but actual other persons as real people who are different than me and sometimes puzzling, just as I can be to myself, but nevertheless have their legitimate, calls and demands and impositions on me that I have to somehow address, even if I wouldn't like to. And so, Murdoch thinks, so here's part of the positive thing. She thinks that we really have to pay attention to not just everything out there, but our own inner life and activity, what's going on with ourselves. We have to get to know ourselves. And, she brings up one example of this kind of activity of, I think it was a mother-in-law who doesn't like her daughter-in-law, or maybe she doesn't like her sister, and she deliberately tries to make herself become more charitable towards this person. So how can you do that? Through, you hear them say something, and your first reaction is like, what a, crappy thing to say. And instead you're like, you could go to something less bad. You could be like, well, I guess they're just ignorant or something like that. But you could also be like, well, they explore the world in a different way than I do. Doesn't make everything that they do or say good, but you can understand it. And that slowly produces a change. And the mother-in-law, I think it was a mother-in-law, eventually gets to the point where when she hears the things that used to tick her off that her daughter-in-law was saying, she has a positive reaction to it. That's a human capacity. We can do that, but we have to pay attention to ourselves. If I think that every reaction that I have to every person is A-okay, I'm not going to do something like that, right? I have to understand the flaws and broken parts of myself in order to see that I might need to do that. So Murdoch thinks that we understand ourselves, or we come to understand ourselves. We never fully understand ourselves. But the best that we do is partly through introspection, but also through thinking about the stories that we're living in. That's why writing novels could actually be philosophical, because we live in time. We live in stories, right? Some of our stories are kind of bullshit. We lie to ourselves about stuff, right? Or when we reminisce about our childhood, sometimes we make it, worse than it was or better than it was, and then we go back. We go to places that we used to frequent, and we're like, oh, this doesn't look familiar at all, well, because we told ourselves false stories, right? But we do live in stories, like it or not, and we live in matrices of relationships with other people. And so some of the key themes that she's going to talk about are attentiveness and attention. She's getting some of this from Simone Weil. Degrees of freedom and agency, the importance of duties, which she'll talk about, particularly in Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, but many of her characters in her novels are interested in what their duties are. Virtues and vices, although she doesn't think we can ever become perfectly virtuous. She thinks that Plato is great that he talked about these virtues, but it's a lot tougher to actually develop them than maybe the Platonists thought. And then eros. So when we think of the word eros, right, we typically think of sex, sexual desire. And for Plato, remember how we were talking about the symposium? In Plato's symposium, there is an ascent that Socrates' teacher, Diotima, this wise woman who taught him everything that he learned about love, we don't know exactly what that means. That's all of what Socrates says. She says, the first thing you do is fall in love with beautiful bodies. You want to screw them. You're infatuated. You want to be involved with them, right? You're in love. And then you start to realize that bodies can be beautiful, but souls could be ugly inside of those beautiful bodies. And there's actually a character kind of like that in the symposium who shows up and tells this crazy story about how he tried to seduce Socrates. His name is Alcibiades. And he's a screw-up. He's a beautiful boy, a beautiful man. But you go from the body to the soul. And we don't say the soul these days, right? We talk about somebody having a good personality, right? And sometimes you look at people and you're like, how in the hell are those two people together, right? Especially if there's like a big disparity in physical attractiveness, you're like, what does he have or what does she have that's got this, Svengoolie-like effect on this other person who's, they're a 10. They're not a 10. They're a 12. They're off the scale, right? What are they doing with this troll over here? And we say, well, they must have a wonderful personality. Or sometimes we say, well, they're rich or stuff like that. But personality is really, really important. And so in this ascent, you move from looking at beautiful bodies, which are beautiful, and then you start looking at beautiful souls, and you fall in love with those. And that leads you yet higher, in Plato's account, to good laws and institutions which form the soul, and then to higher forms of knowledge, and ultimately to that knowledge of the beautiful as such, which is like a great ocean that once you start sailing on, you're never going to come back from. That's what Murdoch is drawing on from the Symposium. So she says of Eros is a continuous operation of spiritual energy, desire, intellect, love, as it moves among and responds to particular objects of attention, the force of magnetism and attraction which joins us to the world, making it a better or a worse world. Our desire, our love can make the world better or make it worse. So she goes on and says, good and bad desires with good and bad objects. It gives a sense to the idea of loving good, something absolute and unique, made evident in our experience through innumerable moments of cognition. Good represents the reality. So this is her Platonism. Good represents the reality of which God is the dream. So she's reversing things. God is just kind of an image, an idea. Goodness is the reality that we can participate in. And she says it purifies the desire which seeks it. And then she says this is not just a picturesque metaphysical notion. People speak of loving all sorts of things, their work, a book, a potted plant, formations of clouds. Desire for what is corrupt and worthless, the degradation of love, its metamorphosis into ambition, vanity, cruelty, greed, jealousy, hatred, or the parched, demoralizing aspects of its absence, are phenomena often experienced and readily recognized. And then she says something else that I think is really quite interesting. Because sometimes people are like, who's to judge? People use these words like good and evil. That's just subjective. You should never call anybody or anything evil because that's mean. She goes on and she says, people know about the difference between good and evil. It actually takes a lot of theorizing to get them to say or imagine that they do not. And the activity of Eros is the orientation of desire. It could be towards good. It could be towards evil. It happens in a lot of ways. And something that starts out good could get corrupted, You fall in love with somebody, you marry them. This happens in a lot of her novels. And then somebody else comes along and marriage has gotten kind of stale. And, this other person is very interesting. You start spending more and more time with them. And boom, you've got an affair. And that's not good, right? But it's coming out of something that feels good. And this is a good sort of transition into another point. So why is she so interested in marriages, divorces, in homosexual relationships, which she has in some of her novels? And, this provides a place for ethics to play itself out. Where do we actually, putting Murdoch aside, where do we actually live as ethical or moral beings? In the relationships and the day-to-day stuff that we go through. In our work, in our love life, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in all these myriad things. You don't have to be a philosopher to, get things right or wrong in those respects. People have been doing this forever. And a lot of people kind of lost sight of that, If we're distracted by a million different things, it could be easy for us to not get that. But we really have to, for Murdoch, pay close attention to what's going on within our own lives. I'll mention one other thing that's kind of funny. So I mentioned that she studied under Wisdom. Wisdom took Freudian psychoanalysis seriously. We're all old enough to remember a time when people did take psychoanalysis much more seriously than they do now. Things kind of swing from one extreme to the other. The American psychological establishment was very, Freud, or if it wasn't Freud, it was Jung or Adler, or what other psychoanalyst that people were drawing on. And then we swung to the other extreme and we're like, that's all nonsense. Can't prove any of it. Cognitive behavior therapy or dialectical behavior therapy, or whatever cognitive approach you want, that's the way to go, right? Because we love to, go to extremes. Murdoch was writing at a time when Freud was still taken seriously, but she doesn't believe in the Oedipus complex or stuff like that. Here's what she actually said in an interview with the Literary Review. She's asked, what areas of Freud's work do you find valuable? And she said, well, there's a bit of deep truth in certain things like the notion of the superego and the id. So you remember what the id is? Well, it's this part of us that just desires, it's kind of stupid, it's unchecked. The ego keeps it from doing whatever the hell it wants to do, right? It's what gets us in trouble. And then what's the superego? It's the internalized voices of authority figures that tells us, don't enjoy yourself, work real hard, you're never good enough, and all that. She's like, well, that's actually pretty true. A lot of people do have those. However, she goes on, and she says, what I agree with in Freud is, frankly, what he frankly says, he's pinched from Plato. If you want to find the id, it's right there in Plato. It's what he calls the appetites, the epithumia. It's right there in the Republic or in the Phaedrus or a bunch of other places, And Freud actually tells you, yeah, I got this from Plato. So we don't necessarily have to get it from Freud. We could go right back to Plato, right? A lot of people have internalized ideas about right and wrong that are basically, the mom or dad who used to yell at them or beat them, or the teacher, the gym coach, or whoever, you're a dirty little child, and now you got to wash your hands all the time, or whatever else. Cover yourself up because, you're awful if you're naked. Clean your stuff all the time because, dirty home. That's another sign of your moral depravity. You can get that out of Plato. So it's kind of interesting that she thinks that you can do that. And then she says the doctrine of anamnesis, this doctrine of remembering realities, is the doctrine of the unconscious mind. The idea of eros as fundamental energy, a drive which includes sex and can be good or bad, that's all in Plato. Freud, what's true in Freud is already there in an ancient philosopher. So, I think those are some interesting points of her philosophy. Obviously, I'm, skipping over a lot because she wrote an awful lot. Before I talk about, the relationship between philosophy and literature for her and her influence, any questions about the stuff we've talked about at this point? Ideas, yeah.
Was it Simone
Weil? Yeah.
Was it her mysticism or her philosophy that was more important to her?
Her mysticism is part of her philosophy, but there's certain themes that are really key that Murdoch is going to kind of pull out. One thing they share in common is the realization that communism isn't actually going to provide what it said it was going to. When you actually watch things on the workers' floor, because they worked with the workers, right? And then this notion of the need to actually pay attention. It's so easy to say, well, we just got to pay attention to things, but it isn't that easy to maintain attention, and it's not that easy to turn it inward on ourselves. And so Murdoch, I think she could have gotten it from other people, but she gets that from Weil. So she thinks that's quite important. And I think another thing you can say, so somebody like Murdoch, she understands that people don't always measure up to their own ideals, but she does want people who are going to like tell us how we ought to live to be at least making an attempt at living a good life, doing what we ought to do. And you can say that Weil did that, Whereas, who would we contrast her against? Bertrand Russell, I guess he tried to live his version of a good life, but it looks much more abstract than what somebody like Weil is doing, saying, well, I want to understand the workers, I better be a worker, So it makes it more relatable, you could say. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions or ideas, comments? All right, well, so Murdoch ends up being somewhat influential, but maybe not as much as some of the other figures that we've looked at, in part because she doesn't have like a systematic philosophy. It's easier if you manage to make it big, if you've got like a program that everyone can get at to do that. But she really does have a lot of, let's call it indirect influence, not direct, but where people are being moved in a certain direction by her. So in the field of ethics, we sometimes talk about the revival of virtue ethics in the 20th century. And it's a bit of a misnomer because the only people that had forgotten about virtue ethics were English or British and American philosophers who were doing analytic philosophy. Thomists were still all about the virtues. People are still talking about it in European philosophy. But, along with people like Anscombe and Hursthouse and others as well, including MacIntyre, they're part of a revival of interest in the virtues that carries through to today. Another area of philosophy that originally comes out of feminist thought, but has some interesting similarities with the focus on particularity that Murdoch has and the importance of our relationships is what's called the ethics of care. And this says that we shouldn't just appeal to abstract principles and then try to apply them in a cookie cutter kind of way. We need to actually focus on people's relationships, the vulnerability that people have to each other, how people develop, And so I think she's, arguably she's got some influence on that. And, she ends up being influential on a number of important philosophers. I already mentioned Alistair MacIntyre recognizes there's something going on with Murdoch that's important. Charles Taylor, really big philosopher, sort of like MacIntyre. Hilary Putnam, an American philosopher. Martha Nussbaum. These are all people who are engaging with Murdoch and saying, she's got a lot of good stuff to say. None of them are Murdochians, right? I don't think there are any Murdochians, frankly. She's not the kind of person who would provoke that sort of follower. There's Kantians out there, right, who are like, I follow Immanuel Kant. I don't believe this part, but I buy into all the rest of the system. But I don't think you could be a Murdochian. But you could be traversing the same path that she's going on and a fellow interlocutor with her, I suppose, right? Now, she is a novelist. And have any of you read any of her novels? They're very good. I came to her not through philosophy, but through her novels. The first one I read, of course, makes sense because I'm a philosopher, The Philosopher's Apprentice. And the philosopher in that's kind of a jerk. He's actually not a great guy. I don't know, is it the philosopher's student or the philosopher's apprentice? The philosopher's pupil. There we go. Yeah, sometimes I get these words mixed up. And then when I was working at Fayetteville State University, I lived about 3 blocks from the big public library, and I was away from my family and teaching at an institution that was probably at that time the most dysfunctional place I'd ever worked at. I actually did find one place more dysfunctional than that later on down the line, and I'll tell you what it is off camera if you want to know, because I don't want to disparage anybody. And so it was a very lonely time, and so I went to the library a lot to get books, and I knew I'd like this one book, so I started reading other books by her. The Bell was the next one that I read after that. And I didn't do it in any particular order. It's not like I said, well, let's read the first one, then the next one. I just grabbed whatever. And I just really enjoyed her writing and the characters and the arguments and thought processes and stuff like that. And it didn't occur to me to ask, is this really a philosophical novel? It was just a good novel, you know? So she is asked in Modern Fiction Studies in '87, do you think there's a similarity between a philosopher and a novelist? And you would expect her to say yes, right? Because she's both. She says, nope, I don't. They're quite different operations. I think it's very dangerous if a novelist attempts to express a philosophy or definite theory in a novel. The traditional novel is a place where people live in all kinds of different ways, where different kinds of characters meet, where it's the deep aspects of human life that are being spoken of and not an abstract theory. Philosophy is very difficult. It's a very different kind of thought, in an essential sense, abstract. Writing a novel means being plunged into all the details of human life. And I remember watching an interview with her, and I think is his name Melvin Bragg. He had this show for a long time, and he's asking her about, you're a novelist, and he says, I've read your philosophy books and I've read your novels, and I almost feel like they're written by 2 different people. And she says, that's a really great compliment. I would love if, nobody actually realized that me, the philosopher over here, is also the novelist over here. And you're like, what's going on there? I mean, why wouldn't you want to bring them together? Why, it's very difficult to do that. She, interestingly, in Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, one of the people she talks about a lot is Shakespeare. And, he's not a novelist, he's a playwright, right? And she says he doesn't try to philosophize. He just has characters who think things through and articulate their ideas. Of course, the reason he's got characters like that is because he created them. He thought them through, right? So that's one of the greatnesses of him. A little bit later on in a literary review interview, she's asked about the philosopher's pupil. And the guy says, the philosopher's pupil is a powerful story of dark obsession and love, riveting reading. It's the first novel in which you've placed a philosopher at the center, almost as if you're outfacing critics who have labeled you a philosophical novelist. And she says, well, the novel really has more to do with a pupil-teacher relationship, which I've been involved in all my life in both roles. I think it's interesting and moving, and I made the character a philosopher because it came along with the package, as it were. I'm writing philosophy at the moment, but of course in The Philosopher's Pupil, the character talks philosophy en passant, meaning, in passing, rather than as part of the story. And then the follow-up to that is, do you mean that philosophy requires a disciplined mind, a mind that can live with the knowledge that the ultimate quest of moral philosophy for the good can never be completed? And then she says, it's impossible to do moral philosophy without asserting values of your own. And as you say, and this is what she thinks too, virtue is unattainable. You can never be truly virtuous. It's a very deep subject, and it can't help being a metaphysical subject. And that's what interests me the most. So she's telling us about her stuff. In the Paris Review, so there's a really great interview with her in the Paris Review, and they ask her, do you base your characters on real people? And she's like, nope, not at all. I make them up myself. And so the follow-up question is, okay, if your fictional characters are not based on real people, as they are for most novelists, how are your characters created? And here's what she says. By this process of sitting and waiting. I would abominate the idea of putting real people into a novel, not only because I think it's morally questionable, and now saying that, that's like a shot across the bows to almost all of her contemporaries, right? Because they're all doing that. They're all, I got to write what I know. And he actually mentions like Hemingway and Lawrence. Hemingway, he's always writing about his own stuff, right? Half the time he's a character in the novels. So she says, that would be a morally questionable. And then she says another really funny thing. But also because I think it would be terribly dull. I don't want to make a photographic copy of somebody I know. I want to create somebody who never existed, who is at the same time a plausible person. The first image of the character may be shadowy. One vaguely knows he's a good citizen or a religious sort of chap. Perhaps he's puritanical or hedonistic and so on. Then I have to have some notion of the troubles he's going to be in his relationship to other characters. But the details on which the novel most depends, the details of his appearance, his peculiarities, his idiosyncrasies, his other characteristics, his mode of being, those will come later, if one is lucky, and quite instinctively. Because the more you see of a person, the more a kind of coherence begins to evolve. And then she's a follow-up question. Your characters are not necessarily innocents. Now, that's an understatement, because a lot of her characters are dirty, scumbags, or halfway scumbags, you could say. So it goes on. They're able to commit violence and all sorts of misdeeds, and yet there exists this imperative within them towards the good. And yes, does philosophy apply here? And then Murdoch, weirdly enough, says, I don't think this connects with philosophy. The consideration of moral issues in the novel may be intensified by some philosophical considerations, but on the whole, I think it's dangerous writing a philosophical novel. It's not the sort of thing writers can easily get away with. Take the case of Thomas Mann, who I adore, for instance. When his characters start having very long philosophical conversations, one feels, well, perhaps we could do without all this. My novels are not philosophical novels. So she is, keeping a strict distance between the two. But at the same time, she's very willing to draw upon novels and other, plays and art and stuff like that for philosophizing, as she does, when she's given the chance to give the Gifford lectures, which is, part of, that's like, you can tell you really, really made it. It's like getting into the Hall of Fame for philosophers, getting to give the Gifford lectures. Half of this book is about literary movements or thinkers. A lot of it is about philosophers as well. And she's actually got a really interesting chapter, which is titled Comedy and Tragedy. And she tells us that, comic and tragic, that there aren't really a lot of genuine tragedies. She says, tragedy belongs to art and only to great art. Human life is full of shadows. Religion is full of them. But human life is not actually tragic. It's more often comic, or there's other things going on there. And then she talks about the novel, and she says, the novel frankly admits, indeed embraces, the instability of art and the invincible variety, contingency, and scarcely communicable frightfulness of life. Novels are, however sad or catastrophic, essentially comic. They're not actually tragedies. It's an interesting thing for her to say. One of the things I'll bring this to a close because it's always nice to have like a great thing to close on. Then we'll do some more Q&A. Murdoch, when you read her, one of the things I really enjoy, and it's even after you're rereading her, because sometimes you forget what she said, is you're reading it and you expect it to go this way, right? You're following along with her and you're like, okay, I know where this is going. And then suddenly she veers off this way. And you're like, what the hell? What's going on here? But it's sort of like, if you were taking a ride through a city and you think you know the map, and then your tour guide, who knows the city much better, veers off. And at first you're like, oh, this isn't good, They're supposed to stay on track. And then you're like, oh, wait a second. This is really interesting. This is cool stuff here. I'm glad we didn't stick to the itinerary that I thought we were on. And I don't know. I appreciate that. I really enjoy that, whether it's in a work of fiction or whether it's in a work of philosophy. Because we have so much stuff that is so predictable and kind of boring and, go by the numbers. So that's what I'll close on with that observation. Any questions, comments, puzzles you want to talk about?
Just
curious,
although she was born after the Irish Revolution, or part of it, the beginnings of it.
Yeah.
Was she at all influenced by that?
She actually wrote one novel situated in Ireland, trying to sort of do justice to that. And yeah, she is influenced in the sense that like everything's messed up and everybody like hates each other, and it takes a long time for things to like work themselves out. And even in like the 70s and 80s, bombings are happening, and she hates the IRA. She thinks that they're very violent, unnecessarily so. But she can understand wanting to stand up against the British domination and stuff like that. And so, in some respects, and she does talk about him in some of her works, she's sort of like Albert Camus, who is from Algeria. His mother is still in Algeria when the Algerian revolt and War of Independence takes place. And Camus is like being badgered to take one position or another, right? And Camus is like, first of all, my mom's still there, so I'm not going to take a really hard position anyway. But I don't find justice on either side entirely. And I think that's the right way to go, right? With a complex thing like that. But you also don't just say, well, everybody's equally good, everybody's equally bad. You still have to take moral stands, but you almost have to be like willing to revise them, because somebody who you think is acting like a decent person, next year they might massacre a bunch of people. And then you have to be willing to say, I supported them now, but what they did, they crossed a line, and this is evil, So, yeah. Yeah.
You had the example with regard to I think it was the mother-in-law. And
trying to change your point of view of like how you interpret the things they say. Yeah.
You're moving beyond yourself, and you're looking, and you're putting attentiveness on the other person. But in some ways, doesn't that excuse the other person? Because shouldn't the other person be doing the same thing and reflecting back? So shouldn't they be tempering what they do, or at least recognizing?
There's a lot of possibilities, right? It could be that the mother-in-law is actually in the wrong, has been misinterpreting things. The daughter-in-law is wonderful and great, and the mother-in-law is just being a jerk, right? In which case, the daughter-in-law doesn't need to do anything. She's already, good that way. But let's say she's as hostile as the mother-in-law is, right? You don't make you doing the right thing contingent entirely on the other person reciprocating. If you do, then it becomes completely transactional, and it never reaches a point of like being in accordance with duty or an expression of virtue or just being a sympathetic person, right? And we experience this all the time. Like, think about parenting. Kids are kind of jerks, even if they're good kids, right?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Wouldn't she want the same of the? Is it the daughter?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Wouldn't she want the same of the?
Wouldn't Iris Murdoch want the same of her? Yeah, but she's only really worried. She's using it as an example to illustrate how our inner actions and resolves, cut off from the outside world, can change us from within. And it could be all. It doesn't have to be just a personal relationship. It could be like hating a whole class of people. You could be like, I was wrong about this, but I still hate their guts. What am I going to do? How can I change this? Right? It takes little actions done over and over again to change your position. And it'd be nice if they do the same thing, but it doesn't require that.
So the thing I'll say is I think it could very well apply to today, in particular with the political environment. If your first impression would be that I hate their point of view and what they're doing, take a different perspective in order to try to move beyond that.
It's tough to do though, right? And I think this is a good feature of it. It's not something where you can say, all right, I'm going to take a different point of view mentally, snap my fingers, all right, there I am. It's like something you'd have to do every single day, And you might, and that's another good thing about Murdoch. She's very realistic. We might not succeed, right? Or we might only partially succeed. I don't have any in-laws who I don't like at this time, but at a previous time, I had a brother-in-law who I just couldn't stand. And I didn't try to make it better because I wasn't reading Iris Murdoch at the time. But had I done that, I'm sure I could have found some things about him that would have tempered my my dislike. I could have learned things about myself. Oh, you're being too judgmental. You think because you study this and he's only watching movies that he's not, he doesn't have anything to offer. I think we have lots of opportunities for these sorts of things, And it's very different than saying something like, I didn't like pineapple on pizza, but now I'll give it a try. I mean, that's so low. You can try stuff out. I don't like liver and onions because my mom made it badly. Let me try it in this restaurant over here. That's not like dealing with a person, right? Those things are easy to change, I would say, compared to changing our overall attitudes towards people we don't like. And it could also be too that maybe there are people who we like and approve of who we shouldn't, and we need to wean ourselves away from that. Think about parasocial relationships where we're like, this celebrity can do no wrong, We don't even know them, right? Maybe we need to be attentive to those sorts of weird, crazy spots within ourselves and wean ourselves away from that too, that's... And the work is never finished, And I kind of like that aspect of Murdoch. She was still a mess when she died. She's not saying, okay, set the bar real low because we're all a mess. Still, the bar is high, and we're probably not going to reach it. But we just try to do our best and support each other in doing that, And maybe we even fail in supporting each other. So, yeah. Any other questions, ideas? I can tell you who we're going to do next year, assuming that we're continuing on with it. I have no reason to think that we're not. Are you curious?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So, ancient philosophy. I'm going to do somebody who we don't have any texts of, but we have a lot of people telling us this is what this guy said or thought or, did. And it's a crazy guy, Diogenes of Sinope, also known as Diogenes the Cynic, because we've done a lot of other ancient philosophers. We haven't done the Cynics yet, so I think he would be kind of interesting to do. For medieval philosophy, we're going to do a late medieval, Meister Eckhart, a great German mystic, very interesting guy. For early modern philosophy, we're going to do Mary Wollstonecraft. And then for late modern philosophy, somebody who I don't know, I didn't mention him in this. I had him in my notes, Karl Popper, who is he's somebody who I didn't like when I read him back in graduate school. And I had a student who recently, a tutorial student, who said, can we work on Popper? And I was like, yeah, I guess so, And then I read his stuff, and I don't know if I misread him back then or if I was inattentive, but I really like him. And now I want to know more about the guy and his background. So, that gives me a year to work on him, on the biography part. And so we're gonna do him. The other video, there's video recordings of all of these, and you can find them online. So if you want to see previous sessions, like on Plato or Cicero or whoever, we've got them available. So, yeah. Well, thanks for coming and for your questions and your attention, and hope this inspires you to go out and read some Murdoch. She's well worth spending the time with.